Hello, my name is Claire Michkowski, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoyed today's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We'd like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you are interested. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the presentation, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rich Barbuto.
Well, thank you all for being here today. Dr. Louis Dimarco was born in Germany and received his Bachelor of Science degree from West Point. During his 24-year military career as an armor officer, Dimarco trained extensively as a tank commander and achieved some notable success. He tells me, and I admire this, on his last gunnery qualification with the M1A1 tank, he and his crew turned in a perfect day and night qualification score of 1,000 points. And out of the 58 tanks in his battalion to go through the qualification, only 3 tanks achieved that perfect distinction. So that's really commendable. Dr. Dimarco lived in Germany over 10 years. He worked extensively with the German Army Panzer Forces and was selected to attend the German General Staff College. He retired as lieutenant colonel in 2005. Dr. Dimarco subsequently earned his PhD from Kansas State University. He is the author of 2 books, War Horse, A History of the Military Horse and Rider, and Concrete Hell, Modern Urban Operations from Stalingrad to Iraq. Dr. Dimarco and his spouse live just north of Lawrence in eastern Kansas on a 60-acre horse farm where there are no tanks, but lots of horses and a John Deere tractor that is almost like a tank. Ladies and gentlemen, Lou Dimarco.
Well, I just want to say I'm very grateful for the opportunity to come here and talk to you today about a subject that is one of my favorite subjects. And so as I talk about German mechanization, I'll be revisiting ground that I've been reading about probably since I was a teenager. Tanks have always fascinated me. The first time I was ever on a tank, I was a freshman in high school, attending Nuremberg American High School in Nuremberg, Germany, and I was in the junior ROTC program, and we had an arrangement to do some tank rides. And so we spent the day just sitting on top and riding around in a circle. But for somebody in high school, it was a pretty fascinating experience. And when I ended up at West Point, I went there with the knowledge that if I was going to be an Army officer, the place I wanted to serve was in the armored forces. It's a lot better to walk, or ride than walk. And there's always some place to get in out of the rain when you're a tank crewman. They're not warm necessarily, but they are out of the rain. And so talking about German armored forces is a subject near and dear to my heart. I think as we talk through this, and let me advance the slides here a little bit. As we talk through this, I'm going to talk to, the title of the talk is Panzers from Nothing. And what I'm going to describe is how the German armor forces go from literally having no tanks to 6 years later having probably the greatest mobile armored force that the world has ever seen. Maybe not great, certainly not great in terms of its technology, maybe not great in terms of its numbers, but in terms of its effect on the battlefield. The German armored forces in 1939 and then again in 1940, and arguably to a certain extent in 1941 as they successfully invade Poland and then France, and then without great success, Russia. Those armored forces probably have an effect on military history and history in general equal to any of the great armies in history, certainly equal to Napoleon's grenadiers, to Caesar's legions, to Genghis Khan's mounted warriors. The German armored forces are in that league. What's fascinating is that in 1933, 6 years before that happens, there's no tanks in the German army. And in 1939, there's an armored force that can literally change world history. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happens, and that's kind of where we're going to go. Talk about what the German army looks like briefly in 1919 when the story begins, right after World War I, and then preparing the Panzer Force with no tanks between 1919 and 1934, and then building the Panzer Force once Hitler takes control politically of Germany and releases the German army from the constraints of the Versailles Treaty. The German army begins embarking on physically building the force that it will employ on the battlefields of World War II. And then finally, I'll talk to you a little bit about some things that are popular perceptions about German panzer forces, both how they were developed and how they were employed in World War II that are not exactly true. And so I hope you find it interesting. Maybe might be a few bits of information that you don't know that are new or intriguing, and I thank you for your attention in advance. So, 1919 World War I is over, and the Allies impose the Versailles Treaty on the German government. And the Versailles Treaty has very specific dictates regarding German military forces, and you see some of them right here. All of these dictates are specifically designed to eliminate Germany as a threat to greater Europe. And they're going to do that by limiting the military capability of Germany. And what the Allies do as they develop this treaty is they look at what makes the German military strong. And so as they define that in terms of the recent World War I experience, then they go down that list and they just prohibit those items. And so the first thing that they do is they say, well, you got this giant German army. That's a threat to all of Europe and has been for decades. So let's just get rid of it. And the Versailles Treaty very specifically says 100,000 troops. That's it. This is from several million men under arms during the war. The Germans are restricted to 1,000 or 100,000 soldiers after the war. Even more restrictive in some respects is only 4,000 of those can be officers. And so the leadership is going to be very thin. And this is juxtaposed against the French army right across the border, which during the interwar period, 1919 to 1939, never falls below an active duty strength of over 600,000. So the German army is 1/6 the size of their what they perceive as their primary enemy, the French. And that's done intentionally by the Allies to eliminate them as a threat to France and to their other neighbors in Europe. No general staff. one of the keys to German military success throughout the 19th century and to the beginning, to the successes that they achieve in World War I, such as they are, is what is known as the brains of the Army, and that is the German General Staff Corps, and it's a corps of select German officers who are the elite of the German officer corps, specially educated, specially trained to be the brains of the German Army. They go through a rigorous selection process. Only about less than 10% of the general officer pool qualifies to attend the German General Staff School. They go through a 2-year staff school where the failure rate hovers around 50 to 70%, or correction, 30 to 50%. And after 2 years, they graduate as general staff officers. And then for the rest of their career, this elite component of the German officer corps is specifically assigned in key positions to lead the German Army, including the chief of the German General Staff, who's the advisor to the Kaiser. Well, to get rid of that brain, the Allies after World War I just say, no general staff. No school, no special education, no special tests, no special assignments for officers. That whole system is illegal, and so they're gone. Then they move on to the major technologies that are developed and are key to the Allied victory in World War I or to German capabilities in World War I, and they just say you can't have them. You can't have tanks, you can't have airplanes, you can't have submarines. And so what they effectively do is they take 3 of the key components of German military capability: the size of the Army, the brains of the Army, and the Army's key technological capabilities, and they prohibit them they prohibited the Germans from having them. And the idea is this ensures particularly the security of France, but also the security of greater Europe, and it will keep the German Army from developing not only its size, but also its internal, the quality of the Army, in order to, and therefore, if not quantity, even the quality of the Army will be affected, and it won't be a threat in the future. And so the Allies are pretty confident that as they come out of the Versailles Treaty, they've taken significant steps to preclude a German threat anytime in the next 10, 20, 30 years. As long as the Versailles Treaty is in effect, it's going to be hard for Germany to pose a threat to anybody. And at the same time, especially the French do not stop maintaining their own army, maintaining their own defenses. The French pour a lot of money in the years 1919 to 1939 into their military capability without let up after World War I. And so you have a German army that is basically significantly diminished, prohibited from advancing. It's hard to develop new capabilities, understand new technologies when you can't have schools and you can't have the technology to work with. And that's where the German army sits in 1919 at the end of World War I. It looks like they're pretty boxed in. Nobody thinks well, I would say, nobody thinks that they're going to be able to develop the type of force that ultimately fights in World War II. But the reason the restrictions are so tough on the Germans is because the Germans have a history of surprising people, particularly the French. And so the reason these terms are so draconian is because the French have a phobia about Germany. It's the Prussian corps that sealed the victory at Waterloo in 1814. It's the Germans who unify the Prussians who unify the German states. It's the Germans who defeat France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And so and it's the Germans who fight World War I, although they end up losing the war. All of World War I on the Western Front is fought in France. And France, the French economy, is by far the largest bill payer on the Allied side for the cost of the war, and one of the major reasons is because initial German successes placed the war on the Western Front inside of the French borders. Germany itself remains untouched by the actual fighting part of World War I, although the economic blockade by the Allies and the drain on the German economy in terms of men and resources have an effect on the home front in Germany. There's no actual fighting in Germany during World War I. So this is where the German army sits in 1919. Because they're limited in the resources that they have available by the treaty, they focus on these three areas to, if not develop their force physically, prepare their force for future war. And they do it through leadership, they do it through doctrine, and they do it through a deliberate policy of enhancing the thinking of the Army, enhancing the thinking of the Army from the individual soldier through the most senior leaders, and enhancing the ability of the Army to think collectively in innovative and progressive ways. And none of these three focuses of the German Army cost any money. They don't violate the Versailles Treaty. They don't materially increase the capability or the threat of the German Army, but they greatly increase the capability of the German Army to rapidly increase its capabilities once the restrictions of the treaty are removed. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of these three, because this is the focus of the German leadership, but for the first 15 years of peace after World War I, from 1919 to 1934, they don't have any money, they don't have any equipment, they only have a few troops, and so in those conditions, they make the best of what they have, not increasing their ability to go to war, but they increase their capability to expand for war when the country calls upon the Army to do so. So probably the most important of these factors, because they set the tone for the rest of for what the rest of the Army is doing, is the leadership. And the German Army in this time period has an abundance of talented, incredibly intelligent leaders. Two that stand out, one that's well known, one that's not so well known, are Hans von Seck and Hans Guderian. Guderian, father of the Panzer Corps, is generally pretty well known to readers of military history. Less well known is von Seck, who is the chief of the German Army for the first 7 years after World War I, and he really sets the tone and policy for the Army as a whole, where Guderian is a middle grade officer, major and lieutenant colonel during this early time period, but is a thinker and a writer about tank and armored tactics. And so von Seck sets the broad policy, and Guderian is the specialist. And between the two of them, they lay the groundwork that when the Nazis come to power and relieve Germany from the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, these two, the groundwork that these two individuals lay is then in place for the rapid expansion and creation of the Panzer Corps. Von Seck's contributions have to do with quality of the Army and a focus on mobility. Von Secht, like most of the 4,000 German officers who stay in the, who are allowed to remain in the Army after the war, as the German Army rapidly decreases, they have to pick who the 4,000 officers are going to be. And they have the entire pool of tens of thousands of World War I veterans to pick from. And essentially, there's two criteria. You're either going to be one of the smartest guys that emerged from World War I, or one of the most decorated, one of the most esteemed combat veterans. And so your typical officer who survives the examination of the officer corps after World War I is a guy like Guderian, who is a general staff officer, has already made the academic cut as one of the smartest guys in the German Army, has already attended the specialized general staff officer schools, and has already achieved in those increased areas of responsibility. And probably somewheres around, of the captains and above, somewheres around 80 to 90% of the officers who remain in the Army are general staff qualified officers. The other group are officers who distinguish themselves exceptionally well in combat. And there's not very many of those, and you have to really be an exceptional young officer if you're not already selected as a general staff officer to make that cut. The type of officer who makes that cut, who's not a general staff officer, is an officer like then at the time Captain Erwin Rommel, recipient of Germany's highest decorations during the war, one of Germany's most decorated combat leaders among the junior officers, and he is the type of exceptional leader who is accepted into the Reichswehr, the peacetime German Army, without making the academic cut into the General Staff Officer Corps. And so that's one of von Secht's contributions. Von Secht is also a very sneaky guy. He understands that the impact of the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, and so he immediately begins to figure out ways to undermine the treaty. He makes deals with the Russians to send German officers to Russia to study armored tactics in Russia without the Allies knowing that that's what they're doing. He wants to create a pool of pilots for a future Air Force. They're not allowed to have any planes, so he authorizes the creation of flying clubs, civilian flying clubs, where pilots are with potential military experience, or who former military officers who are now civilians are trained on gliders. And then and it's all done as a civilian recreational project, and then those guys are employed by Lufthansa, the national airline, and they become civilian pilots, but they're all of that is carefully controlled and coordinated with the Army General Staff so that they know who those guys are, so when they can create an Air Force, the pilots are already there waiting. And he creates a German General Staff and a German General Staff school without having an actual school or without having an actual organization called the German General Staff. He changes the name at the highest level, calls it basically Army Administration, and then he tasks each of his 10 divisions to carefully select young officers and put them in 1 or 2 years of division schools patterned after the education that the old General Staff College used to give, but dispersed among all the units of the German Army. And everybody's very careful not to call them General Staff officers, but everybody in the German Army, and really in some of the Allied armies who are watching closely, realize that they've essentially recreated a German General Staff system without having the physical buildings and without having the insignia and without having the titles. And so, and the final thing, and maybe the most important thing that von Seeckt contributes to the German Army, is he influences the doctrine of the Army. Von Seeckt, most of his experience in World War I is on the Eastern Front, where trench warfare was not as common, where trench warfare didn't dominate. Von Seeckt believes that trench warfare on the Western Front is an aberration, that it could have been avoided if the German Army had fought properly in the first few months of the war, and that a large conscript army, as the Germans had in World War I, was forced to adopt trench warfare because the soldiers and the leaders weren't trained well enough to fight a war of maneuver. And so what he decides to do is to emphasize in the German Army fighting in the open, maneuver, speed, aggressive action, and he believes that that will avoid trench warfare. And he believes with a 100,000-man army, it's a small army, but every man's a volunteer. Every man is carefully selected, so it's an incredibly smart army. And he thinks his smart, small army can fight successfully a battle or a war of maneuver without reverting to the stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front. And he writes that into German Army policy, and he ensures that in every school, in every training event, in every piece of written doctrine, the emphasis is on maneuver, and it gets to the point where German officers are afraid to dig in training, to dig trenches, because they understand that that is expressly against the wishes of the commanding general of the army. In contrast, so the German army basically takes all that trench warfare stuff of World War I, and right after the war, they just throw it out the window and they say, we're not going to fight that way. And based on their analysis of why trench warfare occurred. In contrast, the French and most of the Allies double down on the World War I experience. The French build the Maginot Line in the interwar years as an example of the sophisticated trench system taken to its ultimate technological level of capability. And it's a mindset that puts the defense as superior to the offense. It's a mindset that says we're going to sit here and you're going to, like World War I, you're going to attack us and we're going to bleed you to death. The French totally embrace the World War I trench warfare experience. They have offensive doctrine, but it's offensive doctrine that presupposes you're starting from a situation of defensive stalemate, trench on trench. Even the American Army pretty much spends the interwar years studying World War I, not with the mindset of doing things different, but with the mindset of doing things better. The French, the British to a lesser extent, the Americans are focused in the years 1919 to 1939 with fighting World War I again, except we're going to do it even better this time. We're going to have better rifles, we're going to have better artillery, better airplanes, everything's going to be better, but it's going to be the same war in its essentials. The Germans, in contrast, decide World War I didn't work out so well, we're not going to do that again. And they go off in a totally different direction, and that's von Seeckt's great influence. Guderian, working at a different level, several layers below von Seeckt, understands the Army guidance to maneuver warfare. And he puts his effort into studying, okay, we're going to do it different. Specifically, how are we going to do it different? In 1927, he becomes the chief or inspector of transportation and motorized forces, which puts him in the middle of what little the Germans can do in terms of adopting new motorization technology. They can't have tanks, but there's no rule against having trucks. And so truck-mounted infantry, the influence of just vehicle transportation on tactics and operations is Guderian's focus, and over a series of assignments between 1927 and 1934, he develops a fairly complete idea of how you would integrate this new motorized technology and other technologies, which I'll come back to in a minute, into the doctrine of maneuver that von Seeckt is pushing in general across the Army. So you have two different trends. At one level, at the high level, you've got this emphasis on maneuver without any details. We just want to not do trenches. And then about 2 layers, 3 layers below that, you have guys like Guderian who are working to figure out how to use motorized technology and some other new technologies to make that happen. The leadership is the key, because the rest of it kind of only happens because the leaders are pushing it. Von Seeckt and Guderian together, but primarily in this respect, von Seeckt pushes doctrine. Doctrine is how the Army fights. Von Seeckt looks at 2 pieces of the previous German experience and picks them out and pushes them down to the Army and says, this is how we're going to do it. One is called Auftragstaktik, and the other is called Stormtrooper tactics. And one is a philosophy about fighting, and the other is the specifics of how you're going to fight. And when you but neither of them have much to do with trenches, okay? And when you put those together, they become the guidance for how the Germans are going to fight the next war. Auftragstaktik, as the slide shows, is von Seeckt's emphasis on intelligence and initiative among his leaders. And when he says leaders, he's talking all the way down to like sergeants in the German army. And it basically says, in every situation, the leader on the ground is in command, regardless of his rank and regardless of the situation. And he has a cycle that he has to go through. The first cycle is first step in the cycle is he has to understand the situation that he's in. And this applies to the senior generals, and it applies to the young sergeants. Understand the situation that you're in. Next, understand what your orders are, what you are supposed to do, accomplish. And Auftrag means, in German, your task or your mission, okay? So understand the situation that you're in, and then understand what mission you have to accomplish in that situation. And then determine how best to do that, okay? Von Seeckt doesn't want German leaders to be told how to do something. They're told, understand the situation, and then accomplish this. But they're never told how to accomplish it. It's the leader's job to figure out how to accomplish it. So that's the first characteristic of Auftragstaktik, is the leader on the ground decides how. He's never told how. The second is related to the first. Von Seeckt emphasizes that in many situations, the situation in modern combat changes so quickly that when the leader matches the situation to his mission, they don't match up. In other words, you got a mission, but now that you've actually seen the battle develop, the situation is different than what it was when you were given the mission. And it's the job of the junior leader at that point to make a decision to change the mission. And so he authorizes all German leaders down to the lowest level to make the decision to disobey his order if the order doesn't match the situation. So it is essentially an army where the onus is put on every leader to think about the situation, to match it against his orders, and if they don't match, to change those orders. And under no circumstances will the senior leader in his orders tell the subordinate leader how he's going to do things. Now, of course, this requires junior leaders who can figure out how to do things without being told. All they need to be told is what the end result needs to look like. And it's an army where junior leaders are empowered to disobey their bosses. Now, the Germans are very specific. You can't just tell your boss, I'm not doing that. You have to be able to defend that decision. So if a major orders a captain to do something, and the captain then goes out and he thinks the situation has changed, and he decides we're not doing that and does something else, he may be rewarded for that, or he may be disciplined for disobeying orders. The German army still expects you to follow orders. The difference is, if you disobey orders, you will be punished, and you screw it up. You'll be punished not for disobeying orders. That's allowed. You'll be punished for screwing it up. That's not allowed. So in a situation where a German major tells captain, I want you to move to that table and grab me a cookie, and the captain looks at the table and goes, there are no cookies left. So the situation has changed. So he gets a piece of cake and he brings it back. He's disobeyed the order, but the changed situation made the previous order not logical or irrational or undoable. And so we expect him to disobey that order and use his own judgment and do the next best thing, get a cake instead of a cookie. Now, if there's cookies and cakes back there and he says, I'm not getting that cookie, I'm going to get you cake, that's probably a bad decision. He'll be punished for that bad decision, but not for disobeying the order. It's a very kind of subtle difference, but the Germans are results focused. And so if the results are good, you're rewarded. If the results are bad, you're punished, but you're not punished for disobeying the order. You are punished for not achieving a good result, for exercising poor judgment. In particular, when your boss, because when German officers exercise initiative, their judgment is then scrutinized. If the results are bad, the boss looks at the judgment, and the boss is expected to forgive disobedience if it is in the interest of mission accomplishment. And that's carefully monitored, and there's potential there for difficult senior-subordinate relations. You got subordinates who are constantly not doing what they're told. That can be a problem. And that does come up in the course of German military history in World War II, and in particular in the career of Heinz Guderian, who is one of the great practitioners of Auftragtaktik. He likes to do his own thing. Sometimes he gets away with it. Eventually, in the winter of 1941 in Russia, he's basically fired for disobeying orders when Hitler tells him to hold a defensive line, and he correctly understands that is the wrong military decision, and he withdraws his troops to avoid being cut off by the Russians. Hitler fires him because Hitler's not a real practitioner of Auftragstaktik, and is not very tolerant. But that's the philosophy that von Seck puts into the German army. The other aspect of the doctrine is the way the Germans fought World War I, which is built around this idea of stormtroop tactics. The Allies would attack a position, a series of trenches in a long, broad line of attacking troops, essentially a straight frontal assault. By 1918, the Germans had realized that doesn't work, and they developed a series of tactical techniques called stormtroop tactics, where they would pick a spot and they would focus their troops on one particular point, and then they would attack it with a series of small units. And each small unit had the task of penetrating through the main line. The idea was not to capture or to defeat the main line. The idea was to penetrate the main line And the way you would achieve penetration is with small groups of stormtroopers. And those troops would then move beyond the main line of resistance, leaving the enemy behind them, and find vulnerable targets like artillery, like logistics points, like headquarters. And those were the key targets that they would attack. The idea was if you could get these small groups of elite stormtroopers through the main line and destroy logistics, artillery, and headquarters units, then the main line of defense would still be intact, but would be cut off. And then later, your regular troops would attack, and the main line would fall easily because they were cut off from their logistics, their headquarters, and their artillery. They practiced this in 1918, and it works pretty well, but it doesn't work perfectly. And the big problem with it is, in 1918, the German army is all infantry. And so these guys are moving by foot as fast as they can through enemy lines and getting to these deep targets, which are vital. You can only move so fast and so far by foot. And they were not, in 1918, able to achieve, they could achieve local success, but they couldn't achieve operational or strategic success because the infantry couldn't move fast enough, couldn't move far enough, because they were limited by the fact that they had to walk everywhere. And they had to bring their supplies up by hand. And so they liked the tactic, they liked the philosophy, and it worked well at the local level, but it was not a war-winning tactic in World War I. But they stick with it because it's not trench warfare. These are to do both the Auftrags tactique and to empower their leaders and to do stormtroop tactics. They have to have really smart soldiers. And so they build a system to develop really smart soldiers. 100,000 man army, every man's a volunteer. Enlisted, enlistments were 12 years. Once you got a soldier in, and you educated him and you trained him, you had him for a long time. So he would get better and better and better. Officers were in for 20. Once you were accepted as a regular German army officer, you're in for 20. Unless they didn't want you, but that was it was not your choice. Everybody got tested on a regular basis. If you failed the test, you were out. There was a line of people ready to take your place. Okay, I talked already about the hidden general staff education for the best of the officer corps. I talked about Auftrags tactiques. Everybody was trained in a position 2 levels higher than their rank. So sergeants were trained to act as captains. Captains were trained to act as colonels. Colonels were trained to act as generals. So that when this small army expanded into a multi-million man army, everybody could move up and would have the capability of taking over new units as they were created. And so it was an army that didn't have any tanks, didn't have any airplanes, didn't have any submarines, but it was an army that trained incredibly hard. But just with, it trained on ideas, it trained on concepts, it trained on thinking. It didn't train on equipment. And maybe unique in military history, because of the circumstances forced on them by the Versailles Treaty, the German army didn't have any choice but to do that. And that may have been the key to their success, and it's certainly a position that probably no other army in history has ever been in, where they didn't have the option of spending lots of their energy and hours on working with high technology equipment. Since they didn't have it, all they could do was focus on the ideas and the concepts related to war rather than the hardware. 1933, 1934, Hitler's rise to power, everything changes. The Germans turn over, or Hitler abrogates the Versailles Treaty, lifts the restrictions on the military, turns to the leadership of the military and says essentially, we're rearming, what do you need? Blank check. And so all of the ideas, all of the concepts that they had been thinking about for 15 years since World War I Now they've been given a blank check to go out among the German people and recruit, to go into German industry and develop, and to create the army that they had visualized for 15 years. So by 1933, they had a very good idea from innovative thinkers like Guderian what the army should look like, but it didn't exist. 1934, they're told, go make it happen. How quickly they can make it happen would be the test. And Hitler wasn't going to give them a whole lot of time. And so over the next few years, as rapidly as they could, they built an armored force. They built panzer divisions, they built the technology to equip those panzer divisions, and they built the doctrine to employ those panzer divisions. And this is what Guderian and his peers built that was called the Panzer Division. And it incorporates a lot of the notional concepts that were developed in the Army before they had any tanks. It is a combined arms division. Tanks are the focus, especially in these early divisions. So you have two regiments of tanks, but it isn't just tanks, because tanks are not the key to it. The key is infantry, artillery, and tanks. But the main point is that everything is mechanized. Everything is either pulled by a truck, rides in a half-track, or is a tank. So the whole division moves, and it moves at the same speed. And it has, and all of its support requirements and logistics requirements and all of its command capabilities also are all mobile and move at the same speed. The Germans begin building these in 1934. The Americans don't begin building their first armored division until 1940, only after Poland falls and France falls, and then the American Army says, maybe we should buy a couple of these. The Germans are the first to do it, and they do it well. It's called a Panzer Division, but that's really a misnomer. It's really a combined arms division, and its major characteristic is not the tanks. The tanks are important, but its major characteristic is everything moves, everything's on wheels or tracks, and it all moves together so that it's always together, and the various arms, the infantry, the artillery, and the tanks can all support each other. The tanks themselves, over the years, get to be pretty sophisticated. On the right side, you see kind of the late war German Army tanks. They are very, very capable building vehicles. The three tanks on the right side of the screen, Panzer 5 through 7, are the best tanks in the world in the second half of World War II. The tanks on the left are the tanks that the Germans begin the war with or develop early in the war. They are not the best tanks in the world. In fact, the Panzer I, which is about half of the German Armor Corps in 1939, was designed as a training tank. But they didn't have enough tanks in 1939 when the war started. Hitler started way earlier than the Army wanted to, so they took training tanks to war. The Panzer II is just an upgrade of the training tank. The Panzer I and II are the primary German armor vehicles in 1939 and 1940 when they successfully defeat France and Poland. What's interesting in this slide is on the left side are the early war German armored vehicles. They are at best average, but generally they are below the average capability of French, British, and Russian tanks. In some cases even below the capability of Czechoslovakian tanks. With these inferior tanks, the German Army wins its greatest victories. On the right side of the screen, the German Army is equipped with the best armored technology in the world. If you've seen that movie Fury, this is what they're scared of. This is what the American tank crews are scared of. With these best tanks in the world, the German Army loses. And what this slide tells you is it's not really about the tank. Tanks are important, but they're only part of the system. Maybe the most important thing that the Germans do is develop radio capability. Germans have a very robust, by 1939, radio capability in their panzer divisions. Every tank has a radio. Every combat vehicle has a radio. Leaders' tanks have 2 radios, one to talk to their troops and one to talk to their boss. Senior leaders' tanks have 3 radios. If you see the tank on the top right of the screen, that's a battalion commander's tank. He has 3 radios. He can talk to the other battalion commanders, he can talk to his bosses, and he can talk to all of his subordinates on 3 different radios. Every tank in the German army has a radio. Every combat vehicle has a radio. Not so in other armies, okay? Tanks are loud, noisy vehicles. I was reading something the other day, said being in a tank is like watching a silent movie. You can see, if you're outside the turret, you can see pretty well, but you can't hear anything. You can't hear except an explosion. You can't hear somebody standing next to the tank. You can't talk inside of a tank unless you have radios and earphones so that the sound, exterior noise of the tank is cut off. The Germans have that. So they have as close to perfect communications in their armored force and across all of those arms that are in the Panzer Division. The infantry can talk to the tanks, they can talk to the artillery, and they also wire in the Air Force. In contrast, in the French Army, tanks don't have radios. In the French Army, lieutenants get a receiver so they can hear orders from their company commander, but they can't talk back to their company commander, and they can't talk to the other tanks in their platoon. A company commander in the French Army, a captain, would have one radio that he can talk to his battalion commander, and he'd have a transmitter to talk down to his lieutenants, but he can't hear anything from the lieutenants. It doesn't matter, they don't have radios, transmitters. Most armies in Europe, other than the Germans, focus on the tank as a fighting machine, but not the tank as a communicating machine. And communications in tank warfare are way more important than the actual capabilities of the tank. I will tell you that as a tank commander myself for over 20 years, very first thing when I get in a tank is turn on the radios, make sure they work. When I was a young lieutenant, I was required to be on 2 different radios, my radio and my boss's radio. I had 4 radios in my tank. I was only given 2. I got 2 more because the quickest way for me to get fired was not to be on the radio. Because you can't do your job in the tank, whether you're just an individual tank or you're a tank leader, unless you can talk. The Germans understood that. Nobody else did in 1939. It's not an accident. Guderian, when he was a young officer, his basic branch was Signal Corps. He was a communications officer. He was not a combat officer. One of his first assignments in World War I as a young captain was he was experimenting with the new things in World War I called wireless communications, radios. And so it's not an accident that the German motorized forces put this great emphasis on radios, which enables, with their other leadership traits, and for them to have phenomenal control over their tank forces, even though their tanks are pretty crummy tanks. It's better to have a crummy tank that obeys orders and can do what you want it than a great tank that just sits in the wrong place and doesn't do anything. And that's what happens in the early years of the war, is the Allied forces have better tanks, but they can't employ them. The Germans have crappy tanks that do exactly what they're told to do when they're told to do it, and even when they're not told, because the leaders are empowered to operate even if they can't communicate with their boss. And then, how do you employ this force? Well, they went back to World War I and they said we had this pretty good doctrine of these small groups busting through the front lines and then going deep and destroying artillery and logistics and headquarters forces. That worked pretty well, except that they were walking and we couldn't talk to them because we didn't have radios. And so we liked that doctrine, but we just couldn't execute it very well because of the technology of the time. So let's take this new technology, the motorized forces and the radios, and combine it with the World War I stormtrooper doctrine. And now, when these guys bust through, they can tell us exactly where they are because they have radios. Now, when they bust through, they're not going to go 10 miles a day, they're going to go 30 miles a day. Now, when they bust through, if they're out of artillery range, they can radio for air support. And so the stormtrooper tactics married up with the radios and the tanks, the new technology, kind of the old and the new, enabled the Germans to come up with a way to employ the panzers, which makes trench warfare irrelevant or unsustainable. If you set up a trench, the Germans will pick a spot, break through it, and by the end of the day, they're 30 miles past the trench, and they're destroying all your stuff in the rear. And so this is when we talk about German mechanization. The tendency is to focus on the tank. The tendency is to focus on guns and armor, what my tank can do versus what your tank can do, horsepower, size, and that's all interesting and has some importance, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not the most important thing. What the Germans do different than everybody else is they think about what they want, they imagine it for 15 years, and then when they get the money and the resources, they build it. And they build a whole complete system. They build a integration of concepts, technology, so that it works together. The communications, the tanks, the organization of combined arms, the ability to move infantry with the tanks, and the command and control, both in terms of what the radio gives them and also in terms of their philosophy of empowering their leaders. And at the end of the day, they call that blitzkrieg. A word that you don't find in any German army publications. It's actually probably coined by a journalist to describe what the Germans are doing in Poland in 1939. But it has come to represent this combination of capabilities, which is really German armored warfare. Lastly, I probably made most of these points as I was talking. It's not about the numbers. The French have about the same number of tanks as the Germans. The Germans beat the French in 3 weeks. It's not about technological superiority, although that's nice. French tanks are better than German tanks. British tanks are better than German tanks. Doesn't matter, okay? The British don't have the concepts. They don't have the leadership. The French don't have the concepts, the leadership, the emphasis on maneuver to employ those tanks. So the technology isn't useful unless you have a way and a system for employing it. Leadership is way more important, and a culture of learning is way more important than any technology. I mentioned it's not about the tanks. Tactics are great, strategy is better. What we've talked about here for the last hour or so is really tactics. Low-level tactics, some mid-level tactics or high tactics, some people call that operations, but it's not strategy. The Germans lose World War II because of strategy. The armor force, the panzers, have nothing to do with strategy. Strategy is the grand level, how you integrate diplomacy, economics, military power, and information operations to achieve your political aim at the national level. That's strategy. Hitler is the single strategist for Nazi Germany. The Germans lose World War II because of many strategic mistakes, most of them Hitler's, but not all of them. They don't lose World War II because of the Panzer forces. Their successes in World War II, though, arguably can be largely attributed to their tactical and operational excellence, which is a result of what they do between 1919 and 1939. And on that note, if my technology works here, German panzer forces are the elite of the German army. And to some extent, this represents that. If this works, my little video here.
Obstürmt der Stein und die Sonne uns lacht, der Tag glüht weiß oder weiß kann die Nacht.
This is the Panzer Lied, song of the German armored forces.
Erstaunt sind die Gesichter, doch Gott ist unser Sinn, ja unser Sinn. Es macht unser Panzer den Stunden dahin.
Okay, one last comment. I love that song. I was an armor officer for 24 years. The Germans, what they did with their armor forces between 1919 and 1939 are one of the best examples of a military doing incredible things with almost nothing, except brain power. That results, when they finally do go to war, in an incredibly effective combat force. For an armor officer like me, they are the example of what you want to be able to do, both technologically, but more important, what you want to be able to do in terms of leading troops in combat, where it's about smart, innovative, aggressive leaders taking very technically capable troops and achieving great things. When I was an armor officer in the 90s, I worked at the armor school at Fort Knox, and every year I would go to Germany, to the German armor school on an exchange program. And probably one of the highlights of my career was I was sitting in the officers club in Munster at the German armor school about midnight or so. They were about to close, and me and two German captains and another American officer, and in comes a German officer candidate class off of the night orienteering course. They'd been out in the field for like 18 hours, and this was their last exercise before graduation in typical German Army fashion. They just made it in before the officers club closed, and they were going to have a beer before they went to bed. So they come busted in the door, and they're over in the corner, about 20 or 30 of them, pretty rowdy, down in their big mosses of beer, and us captains were sitting over in the other corner. And I said, you know, one thing I want to do in my Army career is I want to be in Munster at the German Panzer School, and I want to sing the Panzer Lied. So I said to my German buddy, go tell those officers, or officer candidates, if they will sing the Panzer Lied with me, I'll buy everybody a beer. So they were like, yeah, we'll do it. Because even in today's German Army, they're all taught the marching songs of World War II, including the Panzer Lied. And so they all kept gathered around. I said, no, not good enough. I'm buying the beer. Everybody has to stand on the table. So they all stood up on the tables. And then, you know, a cappella, they all start singing. Well, I stopped them after the first line because they weren't stomping their feet. I said, you've got to be in Munster. You got to be at the German Armor School. You got to stand on the table with a beer in your hand and stomp your feet and sing the Panzer Lied. And then they did it, and they did it right. And that was probably the highlight of my armor career. And so with that, I will tell you, thank you for your attention. I know it was a little slow there at some points because it's, you know, the hard lifting of successful combat is often not in combat. It's kind of the intellectual work that happens beforehand. And that is certainly the case with the German forces. So I thank you for your attention. And at this point, I'll entertain whatever questions or comments you have. Sir.
In a previous Fort Leavenworth presentation here, I think about the Battle of Moscow, I thought that I recalled seeing pictures of horse-drawn artillery.
Mm-hmm.
Were those with not Panzer divisions, but other
No, if you look at
divisions?
I'll just use my slides here since I've got the computer capability to back up a few slides. Down in the corner of this slide here, you'll see the growth of the Panzer forces. 1934, 0, okay? 1939, when they invade Poland, 7 Panzer divisions. A year later, 10 Panzer divisions. A year later, when they go into Russia, I think we're up to 21 Panzer divisions. And then by the end of the war, 34 Panzer divisions. That sounds like a lot. The American Army, by the end of World War II, we had 15 tank divisions, okay? They have 34. Now, their divisions, as Germany gets attrited, they're getting smaller and smaller as time goes on. But the real understanding of these statistics has to be juxtaposed against 34 Panzer divisions, over 600 divisions in the German Army by 1945. And so even at the height when in 1939, 1940, when the Germans are doing fantastic things with their panzer forces, the panzer forces, the mobile troops, including not just the tank divisions, but the mechanized infantry and motorized infantry, make up 10 to 15% of the total German force. Everybody else is unmotorized for the entire war. And the Germans employ about, over the course of the war, German army, about 4 million horses, of which they lose about 2.5 million. Not all German. All of the 85 to 90% of the infantry units, everything in that unit is horse-drawn. All the artillery, all the logistics. When they ship supplies to the Russian front, it goes by train to the core rear area logistics point, and then it's transloaded on wagons. And you're doing the same logistics system that Napoleon used in 1812. And that is the Achilles heel of the German military writ large, is that they're not all panzer forces. The panzer forces is a small elite. And that's good enough when you're fighting France, that you can drive across in a day. But when you're fighting across 6,000 miles of the Soviet Union, you can't, the quality of the entire army is relevant, not just the quality of your elite forces. But it's a good question. Sir?
Does that suggest that the philosophy of mobility was restricted to the Panzer Division, and the other units and commanders didn't have buy-in on that?
No, it's not. It's a function primarily of economics. The Germans, the German national economic capability just isn't able to provide the motorized transportation and tanks for the entire force. That's one reality. Two, the Germans make stupid strategic decisions about economics. For example, the U.S. goes to war in 1941. In 1940, President Roosevelt puts, the U.S. Congress passes the War Emergencies Act. President Roosevelt puts the United States on a war footing and begins the draft a year before Pearl Harbor, okay? When that happens, U.S. industry stops making cars. U.S. auto industry converts to wartime production of military vehicles, and we don't make cars. We don't sell cars in the United States during World War II. The Germans don't stop making commercial Volkswagens until 1943. They've been at war 4 years before Hitler gives the authorization to cease all civilian production and convert it all to wartime production. By then, the war's already lost. The American Army understood strategy. Strategy is about economics, diplomacy, military, and information operations. The German Army understood the military part of strategy, didn't have a clue about the other stuff. And even the military part of strategy, they weren't that good at. And the American Army was a mediocre army in World War II at the tactical and operational level. We were a great army at the strategic level. The Germans were great tactically and operationally, and probably not even mediocre strategically. And that's why I had on my myths there, better to be strategic, good at strategy, than good at tactics. Sir?
Was Hitler developing the infrastructure at the end, or during the Versailles Treaty, so that when he said, the heck with the Versailles Treaty and now go build tanks?
No, Hitler wasn't. The German military leadership were thinking about fighting a war as a national army, as a great power, not as this little professional army that they were forced to have. So they were mentally ready to make the shift. But Hitler had nothing to do with anything until he comes into office 1933, 1940. So he's a non-player. He reaps the benefits of I say machine, but they really didn't have any machines. What they had was a philosophy and a culture of professional excellence. And he is, he's a dictator, psychopath, and he's given this phenomenal tool, and then he does bad things with it. But he has nothing to do with making the tool. He's just a lucky guy. Sir?
when they saw what was happening in Germany, what could they have done to impede him or stop him from coming up with this army, with panzer divisions, et cetera, et cetera? Could they have done anything to stop him?
Early?
To the war.
Early, probably so. I mean, if you look at the chart there, 1934, Hitler's in power. He doesn't have any panzer divisions. As he becomes more and more aggressive in his foreign policy, he is, you know, if you add up all the allies, but if you just add up the guys on his borders, the Polish on one side and the French on the other, he's outnumbered and outgunned significantly through at least 1938. Even in 1939, he probably doesn't have the ability to fight the Poles and the French at the same time. You know, the Germans invade Poland, and France and Great Britain declare war on Germany. And then what do the French do? Nothing for 9 months. And in those 9 months, the Germans take their army out of Poland because they just left a skeleton force along the French border. There's nothing to stop the French if they would have invaded Germany at the same time. The Germans would have been in a big hurt. The German military professionals were scared to death that the French were going to invade. They thought the plan to invade Poland was crazy. Hitler told them France and Great Britain wouldn't declare war. They did, but Hitler was right in that even though they declared war, they were unwilling to be aggressive because they had this World War I trench warfare vision of battle, and they thought, oh, if we attack, it's going to be World War I all over again. Millions of people are going to die. It's all bad, so let's just kind of do nothing. And in literally 9 months, September to June, the German army picks itself up, moves itself to France, and then they sit down and, because they're really smart guys, they look at all the mistakes they made in Poland and they fix all of that. So they're even better army when they invade France in May of 1940. Sir?
Could you explain a little of the clandestine training in Russia?
Not my strongest area, but what the Russians had that the Germans didn't was equipment. And so they were able to move officers over there. The Russians respect the German military. They don't ideologically have anything in common with either the Republic, the Weimar Republic, or even later the National Socialists, the Nazis. But they understand the Germans are good soldiers. And so the Russians look at it as a win for them. They get to see the Germans demonstrate their tactical and doctrinal concepts. The Germans look at it, they get to play with real equipment. So it's a win-win. Interestingly enough, if you had to rate the armies, or at least the intellectual capability of army leadership across the European armies in this period of the 1920s into the early 1930s, the Soviet army would give the Germans a run for their money. Not on an individual basis, because the Germans are an elite army. Everybody's smart. But the senior Russian leadership, especially a guy named Marshal Tukhachevsky, who is the Russians' armor expert, is every bit as brilliant as Guderian. He doesn't have the excellent small army to work with, but he's got the industrial power of the Soviet Union. The problem that the Russians have in 1941 when the Germans invade is Stalin, a few years before that, purges all of that senior leadership. All those guys who had won the Russian Civil War and then had experience fighting against the Poles, and the smarter they were, the more likely they were to be eliminated by the purges. And literally hundreds of Russian generals are executed by Stalin, so that when the Germans do attack, the Russian army is essentially, its leadership has already been destroyed by the Communist Party and Stalin. And if they had had that senior leadership intact, even the 1941 Operation Barbarossa would not probably have been nearly as successful as it was. Russian troops are very brave. Russian armor technology is the best in the world. At that time, and even at the end of the war, is every bit as good as the Germans. And they had really good leadership, but the operative word is had, because they killed them all. Sir? And And then I'm going to try to be systematic here.
What were the American military leadership, particularly the Army, doing during the 1930s? Were they watching what the German leadership was doing?
We had guys in Germany, and I've read their reports. So we knew kind of what the Germans were doing. But our Army was not that innovative. We were particularly strapped for money. We were a tiny, tiny Army. Voluntarily, we were just a little bit bigger than the German Army, about 150,000 active duty troops. And so we had no money, and we had no money to train, and we were scattered. Unlike the Germans, there are 100,000 troops in a country the size of 2 states, Oregon and Washington. We have 150,000 troops scattered from the Philippines to Puerto Rico. And so, in terms of density, if you had 2 American soldiers in the same place at the same time, you could have an exercise, because that didn't happen too often. And because of isolationism and the Depression, we were even, Hitler begins rearming in 1934. We're still in the midst of a depression in 1934. We don't form our first new kind of innovative mechanized unit until 1933, and by 1939 we have 2 of them, 2 small units of mechanized cavalry. By 1939 the Germans have 7 panzer divisions, because we're still not on a war footing and we have no budget. We had smart guys. We were looking closely at what the Germans were doing, but in relative terms, we are a much smaller and less well-funded army than the Germans, even when they're under the Versailles Treaty, because unlike the Germans, we have responsibilities in the Panama Canal, in Hawaii, in the Philippines, and when you disperse the army like that, it's very difficult to do any training. And then we had and then those missions all required everything in our budget. So there's no money left over to do any training, even if you could get units together. No training happens, serious training happens in the American Army till really 1940, after we kind of see the war clouds sort of happening in Europe, and FDR says, okay, we're going to start giving you some money. And then we did have some guys who were pretty reticent, like the French, and to a lesser and to some extent differently than the British, but with the same result. A lot of our senior leadership wanted to fight World War I over again. And in many ways, much of our Army does in World War II. We don't build a Panzer Army. Our armored divisions are as close as we get, but like I said, we had like 15 of those out of 69 divisions. Sir, and then I promise this side of the room, and I know I'm running out of time too here.
Okay, in September of '39, when the war broke out, what were the comparative strengths of Germany and the French and the British in terms of airplanes and tanks and soldiers?
Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly the numbers. I do know that the French, probably about the size of the German army, and they remained comparable. They remained comparable right through 1940. The difference is in organization. The French don't have armored divisions at all. All of their tanks, they have about the same number of tanks as the Germans, but they're spread out throughout the French force. When you throw in, and the BEF, of course, doesn't count in the strength. The BEF is a fairly small organization, and compared to the German and French armies, but and not very professional at that point in terms of armored doctrine. The British, who had invented the tank, don't put any emphasis on armored warfare, or very little emphasis on armored warfare in the in-between time. And both the French and the British, their view of the tank is not as this combined armed strike force like I showed you the Germans had. Their idea was you take little groups of tanks and you give them to the infantry, and as the infantry walks slowly towards the enemy, the tank follows behind, giving them covering fire. And they would spread their 2,000 tanks or so out across evenly distributed across all their formations, where the Germans would take their 2,000 tanks and put them in one place at one time to achieve that penetration. With the Polish army and the French army in 1939, there are actually more allies. The Germans are outnumbered, which is why the Germans are concerned. Air power, similar. The Germans have a slight edge, if I remember right, in numbers, but German doctrine and to a lesser extent, German technology is far superior. The German Air Force, technologically, in 1939, their Messerschmitt fighters are better than anything that the Allies have except the Spitfire, and the Spitfire is limited in numbers and only the British have them. So German air power, and like their armor, the Germans consolidate all their air power and they use it decisively where they're going to attack. The Allies spread their air power out and aren't really sure how they're going to use it, and most of it, because the Germans attack first, is destroyed on the ground. So, you know, across the board, this philosophy that the Germans have influences their ability to effectively employ air power as well as their elite army forces. And I'm sorry, I just don't know the numbers specifically, but I know approximately how they rate, and it's as I described. On this side, in the back, and then we'll come up here.
If like another country or like a nation group of people like the French or Italians or British were under like a harsh treaty like the Treaty of Versailles, do you think they'd be able to pull off like a feat like this, or was this truly like a German central kind of like a German people were able
That's
to
a good question, and I would say one of the reasons I use this word here is culture. It's a combination of leadership and culture, and they kind of go together. The organization, the Germans really respect brain power. They test for that. To this day, in the German army, testing and passing tests are as important to promotion as what your boss says about how good you do in a job. In other words, you can do a phenomenal job in whatever your duty is, but you have to do that and then take a test and show that you're smart in order to get promoted in the German army. You know, without dinging too hard on the American army, I can tell you that it is possible today to make it all the way to 4-star general in the American army, and the only test you have to pass is the physical training test. Okay? There are no other tests in the American army. The German army, especially in this period, was a rigorous gauntlet of annual testing, evaluations, critiques, and then the guys who pass move to the next level. And then they go through a gauntlet of testing and critiques and evaluation, and then they move to the next level. So that's the culture. And so, yeah, and that's uniquely German military, but it also reflects German society. You know, in German society to this day, you take a test, I think around the 7th grade, and based on those test scores, they decide you're going to college and you guys are going to trade school. And if you want to go to college, when you're about 13, 14 years old, you better do well on those tests or you're not going to be qualified to go to college because you didn't pass the test or you didn't get a high enough score. And that's how, you know, so it's cultural. It's not just the military that's in German society that is focused on this testing to identify excellence and then promoting excellence. And not to say the people who don't go to college aren't good, it's just they have a different role to play in German society. And in the German army today, when you're a captain, you take a test. And those guys, about less than 10% who pass that test around year 7, they go on to be colonels and generals. Everybody else retires as a lieutenant colonel. And there's no crossover. So 90% of the German officers will never, they know by their 7th year of service in a 40-year career that they're not going to be generals. Only the elite advance. And it's a different philosophy about how you pick your leadership that pervades German culture. It's different than the way we do things. It's not everybody deserves a shot, and it's not you know, egalitarian. It's very kind of regimented. Sir?
month, we looked at the historical development of the general staff, particularly in Germany after 1870. And you can look at the mission tactic as a response to the cutting off of the head of the general staff and the diffusion of the intelligence from the general staff into the body of the army at large. But you said von Secht thought that trench warfare wasn't necessary. And does that mean that the vaunted German general staff was out of touch with conditions on the ground in World War I, and that the local leaders on the scene didn't have the flexibility to act?
That's a good question, and in fact, historians of the German army looked hard at that question. You know, is the German failure on the Western Front indicative of the failure of the German general staff? I think, you know, there's evidence you can argue both ways. I come down on the side that and I think this is the dominant view, is that if you look at the details of how the German army operates on the Western Front, what you see is that the Germans very early on recognized the problem of the trenches. And this is through the mechanism of the general staff. It's the general staff officers and that system that goes, hey, trench is bad. We got to figure out what to do. And then their response is twofold. One is, we're not attacking trenches until we do figure out what to do. And so you don't see mass, large-scale offensive operations in the German army from 1915 to 1918. Okay? In general, you don't see that. And that's a deliberate decision by the Germans. First off, they're in France, so we got France, part of it anyway. So we don't have to attack. And second, we don't want to attack because we don't know how to do it without getting ourselves clobbered. And instead, the general staff turns to how do we defend most efficiently, and they build this elaborate defense in depth system, which is almost impossible for the Allies to overcome. And that's where they focus their energy, 1915 to 1917. At the same time, general staff officers are working this problem of how do you attack a trench, and the storm troop tactics is the solution that they come up with. But it takes them several years of trial and error to get to that point, but once they find it, they execute it, not perfectly, because the infantrymen just can't do what they want them to do. They achieve great tactical and operational success, but not strategic success. Having said all that, there are cases where the Germans do attack and they screw up and they get lots of guys killed. Most of those cases, Verdun, for example, it's because individual German commanders, senior commanders, corps, army commanders on the ground, are not doing what they're told. They're told, we want you to stay on the defensive, let the Allies kill themselves against us. And they're too aggressive and not very smart. The German army in World War I has a lot of royal leaders who are in command positions because they're related to the Kaiser, princes and barons, and they don't always make the smartest decisions. So the German army is not perfect in World War I. They screw up. But generally when they attack and suffer mass casualties after 1914, it's because it's because they're screwing up. Some individual leader is screwing up and is going against what the general policy is. And so, I think that the general staff system works. But the trench problem is a sticky problem, and it takes them a while to figure it out. The Allies are going through the same trial and error process, except they're expending a lot more lives doing it. And okay, we're going to 4:30, so this could be the last question.
Okay, you discussed the inferior early German tanks defeating the Allied tanks that were superior. Could you go over some reasons other than the supply failure and strategic failure, why the later German tanks that were superior, that they were defeated? Could you go over reasons why they were defeated? Sorry if I'm phrasing this incorrectly.
Go ahead.
Could you go over some reasons why the superior German tanks in the late war were defeated?
By the Allies.
Right.
Okay. There's a couple of easy answers to that. One is, again, German leadership didn't understand economic strategic warfare. They're always tinkering, looking for a better tank. And so you saw they have 3 model heavy tanks, the Panzer V through 7. All three of them are different, okay? The Panther, the Tiger 1, and the Tiger 2, they have different engines, different transmissions, different suspension systems, different turrets, fire control, everything is different. There's no compatibility of parts, which means you have to have a completely separate supply system for 3 different types of tanks. And oh, by the way, those aren't their main tanks. The main tank is the Panzer IV. So now you have 4 different supply systems. You have to have 4 different types of trained mechanics. You have to have 4 different ammunition systems to provide ammunition. And the Germans tend to, especially with the late war tanks, make them as proficient as possible. Tanks are still cutting edge technology, and because they keep changing designs and keep upgrading, German tanks break down a lot. So a tank unit might have 50 tanks, but would be lucky to have 50% of them operational at any one time just because of routine maintenance failures. American tanks, in contrast, we have 1 general tank. So we have 1 kind of ammunition, 1 kind of support part system that supplies it, and 1 training system to supply mechanics and crew. Each German tank, of which there are 4 major types by the end of the war, the internal crew drills are different. So if you move from being a gunner on this tank to being a gunner on this tank, you've got to be retrained. And then they will have, in a regiment, a battalion of these kind of tanks and another battalion with this kind of tank. And then within a battalion, they might have 3 different variants in the different companies. And so it's a huge logistics nightmare, an operational nightmare, because to keep that force operating. Second, because they don't have the resources the United States do. The Germans build about 20,000 tanks or so during the course of the war. I want to say American tank production is about 20,000 per year. And the Russians make that number look tiny. So they're way outnumbered. So it doesn't matter how good, you have 1 good tank, but if the other guys have 25 okay tanks, and the Sherman is an okay tank, the 25 okay tanks beat the 1 good tank most of the time. And so it's largely a numbers and a logistics issue, not a tank-on-tank issue, especially on the Eastern Front. The Russians have really good tanks, really simple tanks that rarely break down, and they got tons of them, and they outnumber the Germans. We outnumber the Germans maybe on the average 4 to 1, 3 to 1. The Russians outnumber them 6 to 10 to 1 in tank battles. And the Germans will get 6 Russians for every German, but it doesn't matter because there's 10 Russians. So that's kind of the simple answer. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. Appreciate your time.